All right, cool. Okay, so hello everybody. Just for some starting procedures, if you haven't already, it's the same as the rest of camp. Change your Zoom name to just your first name for privacy reasons. Please mute yourself during the lecture and turn on your camera obviously if you feel comfortable and if it's possible. Please refrain from spamming chat or having external conversations during the lecture. And yeah, we'll start 10 minutes after, which it's already passed. And if possible, if you guys could download verbatim paperless debate, I sent the link in the chat. It'll be really helpful. You'll need it pretty much for every debate throughout the season and for the drill at the end if you want to participate. Okay, so today's lecture is going to be about cutting cards, basically finding and how to deliver evidence in pretty much any form of debate you're going to do, whether that be Lincoln Douglas, policy debate, public forum, etc. And yeah, so I guess the lecture will be split up into about 3 parts. The first is going to be about the role of evidence in debate generically, and then I'm going to talk about the application of evidence in a debate round and certain strategies that you should know about how to deploy evidence in every debate. And then finally, how to cut cards using Word and more technical stuff. So yeah, so all right, so first, I'm going to talk a little bit about role of evidence in debate, just because if I were to just give a lecture on how to cut cards with Word, the lecture would be like 5 minutes long, and I don't want that to happen. So let's just talk a little bit like evidence and how evidence is used in debate. This will also give you a better understanding about when you cut cards and probably make you a better card cutter. So essentially, in debate entirely relies on evidence to create coherent arguments. So without a chain of evidence and without a good substantial amount of evidence, essentially your arguments have no cohesion and they don't tell a story. So in policy debates and public forum and Lincoln Douglas, whenever there's like a constructive speech and you're trying to build your case to a judge, so that's usually like the first few speeches in a debate round. Evidence pretty much makes up 90 to 100% of these speeches because they are what lend truth to your argument. So without substantive evidence and a lot of cards, you're basically just reasoning to the judge, and that gives really no appeal. And also, they're a stasis point for discussion. So because both teams have evidence and use a variety of different evidence, besides just the reasonings that they deliver, they create a lot of contradiction that also spices up the debate and makes discussion a lot more possible. So what is a card? So when we refer to a card, it's essentially like a singular consolidated piece of evidence. So when we say cards plural, it's essentially various pieces of evidence from different sources. So you can define a card as, yeah, a singular consolidated piece of evidence in debate, and it consists of 3 parts: a tagline, a citation, and a body. So I'll share my screen and show an example of what a card looks like on Word in a second. But right now, basically, a tagline is the top of a card. It's self-written, so you write it yourself, and it's a summary or a thesis of basically what the piece of evidence below it is saying. And so we refer to essentially there's this paradox of power tagging. Basically, you want the tagline to be favorable for your argument because it summarizes what the evidence says, and it basically makes the point to your judge, because usually the judge listens most closely to the tagline, and good judges will listen to what the evidence actually has to say, but the tagline is the part that stands out most. So you want to refrain from tagging the piece of evidence that you have as something it doesn't actually say, because you'll probably get called out for that in the debate round. But you also want to make sure it's convincing and stands out and is memorable to the judge. So after, right below the tagline, there's a citation, and the part that you actually read in round is the author or the last name of the author and then the year it was published. So it would be I'll use Jason as an example. It would be Ma in 20. And then the rest of the citation is usually in smaller font. And the rest of the citation consists of, typically in the order, the author's full name, so first name and last name, their qualifications, so their credentials, where they work and what they do, the article's source or title, so in parentheses, the name of the news article online, the publisher, so that's like BBC or whatever news station or publisher you found it off, the date it was published, so month, day, and then year, and then the URL or source. So that's probably pretty important, probably the hardest part to remember in cutting cards. But generally, it's pretty relaxed. And in debate, there's not like a specific format. So it's not like in writing research papers, you have MLA or whatever. No one's going to dock you or call you out if you messed up the format. As long as you have these essential parts in it, it's fine. And then the last part of a card is the body. So that's the bulk of evidence that you directly copied from the article. So it's word for word what you're going to say. And usually it's either an excerpt or the entire article. I'll talk a little bit more about that later about excerpts versus whole articles. And it's not entirely read. So that's the, I guess, the critical thing for debate and its difference in usual. So I'm going to share my screen and uh, show you an example of some cards. Okay, so when we look at a card, this is essentially one card from top to bottom. So the tagline or the thesis of the argument is this top little bit that's in bold that reads Trump will lose now, but voters are still malleable. That's basically the thesis of what the card is saying. So without even reading the card, the judge and the opponents can expect the argument you're trying to make. And then this piece right below the tagline is a citation. So that little bulk, the bolded bit is the part that you would actually read. So Hill in 20, that's the last name of the author, and the year it was published, 2020. And the rest of the citation is in smaller font, and it basically is the citation I mentioned earlier. It's in a slightly different order, but it consists of the credentials of the author, so PhD, Associate Professor of Political Science at UC San Diego, who studies how citizens motivate politician behavior. His first name, Seth, and then in parentheses, the name of the article, the publisher, and then the URL of the article. So that's the entire citation. And then this is the rest of the card. So this is basically an entire article condensed and shrunk into one paragraph. And I'll show you how to do that in a second. And you can notice that there's multiple parts of the card. So the parts are shrunk like this are basically not read. And the pieces that are bigger and underlined are the essentially main parts of the card. I'll talk about the different parts of highlighting and underlining cards later. But the highlighted bit is what you would read in a round. So if this was a singular card and I would read in a round, I would read Trump will lose now, but voters are still malleable. That's Hill in 20. And then I would start reading the highlighted bit. So there's good news for Joe Biden. He's building a diverse coalition of support that could win him the state and the electoral college vote, etc., until the end. And all of the underlining, highlighting, and shrinking is manual. So you get to choose what you highlight, what you want to read, and the parts of the card that are actually relevant. I'll talk about a little bit more about how to determine that later. Okay, so So knowing that cards are essentially just pieces of evidence, they can support a variety of arguments. So as I mentioned before, cards combine to form cases. So I'm sure you've already sort of heard this from the introduction lectures, like Intro to Policy and Intro to Public Forum. But when you're presenting a constructive case and you go up and you give your first few speeches debate round, it's almost entirely evidence, and you want to tell a coherent story about the side you're taking, so that be it af or neg, and what your position is. So in policy debate, that would be specific to your policy or your plan, and in public forum, it would be about your case and your advantages. Yeah, the constructive speeches use evidence to tell a coherent story, and they're also used for arguments like uniqueness, links, impacts, solvency, framing, and answers to all these arguments. I'm not just gonna assume that you know what all of these debate arguments are, and you might not, but that's not that important. Mainly, it's just like all of these arguments and any specific thing you want to make always starts from a piece of evidence, and how you debate that evidence and how you bring the evidence into later speeches later in the round and in rebuttal speeches where it's mostly your own analytics and your own reasoning is your own technique and techne, but they all stem from the piece of arguments that you read in the initial speeches. So finding cards, like Googling and finding the first-hand sources that you want to use to create your card is no different than conventional research. There's no secret to it. It's basically the same thing as how you find evidence for your essays in school through Google books. And yeah. All right, so I guess I'll talk a little bit more about how certain like arguments like these. So we have arguments like uniqueness, links, impacts. I don't want to get too much into the specifics because this is getting into like something that's off topic a little bit. But let's say you were to find a card for uniqueness. So if you don't know what uniqueness is, it's basically an argument and policy debate that says that something has not happened now, but it will happen as a result of what your opponent does. So for example, like a very good example of what uniqueness is the first card I just showed earlier. So if we look at this card about Trump will lose now, but voters are still malleable, that's a uniqueness card that says that in the status quo, so at this very moment, Trump is set to lose the election. And then this further feeds into the later parts of the disadvantage or the position. So a good card for uniqueness would obviously be recent because you wanted to say something that in the status quo and as the most recent point in time, as much as you can make it, it's something's bound or not bound to happen. So there's obviously like certain parts of cards that are more important for certain points you're trying to make. So for example, for uniqueness, recency is probably the most important thing that you want to take into consideration. And then there's arguments like the internal link. So internal links usually come right after uniqueness, and they show a causal relationship between why a certain action that your opponent proposes will lead to something else. So the uniqueness card said that Trump is going to lose the election now, but let's say the AF team proposes that like there's that we should do a certain type of criminal justice reform. So that's the policy 2020 resolution for this year, criminal justice reform. So the next card reads Trump is desperately trying to portray himself as a criminal justice reformer, but that rings hollow now because no accomplishments beyond the First Step Act. And then the next card says the plan gives Trump that key accomplishment. Criminal justice reform, or CJR for short, is a salient issue that flips the election. So you see the transition between uniqueness and the internal link. It's saying that right now Trump will lose, and that's pretty good because the argument that these cards are trying to make is that we don't want Trump in office anymore. But because the AF team proposes a criminal justice reform policy, that flips the script because it frames Trump as accomplishing something. And because criminal justice reform is such a specific issue, it has enough power to flip the electoral college and flip the voters. And throughout all of these arguments, you see each card has like the body here. You want the body to support uh, what is the tagline says as much as possible, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. And then for impact cards, so I guess impacts are like the final end result of something that has real world implications, and I'm pretty sure the other lectures have also covered a little bit about what impacts are, but they're basically what the judge is able to evaluate in the round and consider the significance of certain scenarios. So these last two cards go together to form an impact. So the star 19 evidence says that Trump re-election leads to irreversible and catastrophic climate change. And if we read the piece of the card, like the content of the card, it talks about how Trump climate policy is uniquely bad and is probably a lot worse than any other president, and it is causing us to become or get to the point of irreversibility. And the last card, it says extinction. So if Trump were to stay in office and his climate policy were to continue, that would probably create devastating effects that would be irreversible and lead to like beyond the threshold of human survivability. This sounds far-fetched, but in policy debate, we love far-fetched things and we love saying everyone will die. So examples of this is essentially an example of like the different forms of arguments that evidence can support. And if you don't understand like what all these evidence or all these arguments were, like uniqueness, internal link, impact, that really doesn't matter. Like you'll learn that as you learn policy debate, and that was a pretty specific example that I gave that was probably not ideal. But my point was that evidence is used for a variety of arguments, and each piece of evidence should be tailored to the point you're trying to make. So for uniqueness cards, you want the card itself to say that Trump will lose now, which in this card it talks about how right now Joe Biden leads Trump in the electoral college vote and has won most of the swing states. For internal link cards that say that what the other team or your opponent does is uniquely bad and causes something bad to happen, this card talks about how criminal justice reform is a key issue in 2020 presidential elections, and that if Trump were to take a stance on criminal justice, he would win the majority of voters. And then for impact cards, cards that you want these cards to kind of exaggerate as much as possible and say what you want to say. So the impact here is catastrophic climate change that leads to extinction. The content of the card says that the effects of a full 8 years of Trump would be impossible to undo, and climate change would become hard to address, and the biggest difference would be irreversibility. So you see that like it's pretty self-explanatory, but the research you want to do to support these scenarios are all in the pieces of evidence. And then obviously, when you want to answer these arguments, you want to read cards that say the opposite and contradict. And this is where the point I talked about how cards are the stasis point for contestability comes into play. So because you'll obviously find evidence that say exactly the opposite of what your opponent says, and in that case, it's like, okay, so who's right? And that all comes down to a number of factors, including things like how recent your evidence is, the credibility of your author, and the reasoning that the evidence gives. But that all comes down to just however you feel like debating it. All right, back on topic. So let's talk a little bit about card quality. I kind of already covered this. So there's 5 key things that you want to consider when you are finding a piece of evidence. This is sort of just synonymous with when you're doing research papers as well, but they are particularly important in debate because these things are what your opponents and judges will look at. So first, it comes from a credible author, organization, or a stakeholder of relevance on the topic. So for example, if you're finding a card about criminal justice reform, which is the topic for this year's policy debate, you want an author that preferably is a writer that frequently talks about criminal justice or the criminal justice system in the United States, and you or from like an organization that's just inherently credible, like just BBC or whatever news station. And then if you've listened to any other like critique lectures. There's some coming up for like Afro pessimism, I think is coming up tomorrow, or other critiques like settler colonialism and capitalism. You want, in that case, it's really important to have authors that are specific to your genre of literature. So, for example, for Afro pessimism, prominent authors like Moten and Wilderson are 2 African American authors who are key stakeholders and probably make up a majority of the literature base surrounding that argument. So second is recency. That's pretty self-explanatory. You want arguments that are preferably from this year or recent, especially if that's a scenario that's going to happen. So this becomes really important when you see teams reading cards like extinction is going to happen in the next year and it's from 2015. So you basically just rat them out and say like, if extinction was going to happen in the next year and this evidence from 2015, why hasn't it happened yet? So recency is pretty essential when it comes to certain arguments, but also certain arguments are pretty like, some arguments have exceptions to recency. For example, critiques. Pretty much all critique cards come from a long time ago because they come from like a historical background that really doesn't matter about recency today, and it's probably actually more credible if it comes from a long time ago because that's when all these theorists began theorizing these critiques. Okay, so the third point is that the card itself offers substantive warrants that explains the reason behind the thesis. So this is pretty self-explanatory as well. If you look at the body of the card, you want the body of the card, so the actual content and meat of the card, to say what your tagline at the top wants it to say. So if you're claiming that something will lead to extinction or that a certain thing will happen because of what your opponent does, you want the card to be as specific to that as possible. So for example, if the affirmative team was like, hey, we should end the death penalty because the death penalty is bad for X, Y, and Z reason. You want your evidence that addresses that to be as specific as possible. That says that the death penalty, like getting rid of the death penalty, will cause X, Y, and Z, and that's bad. And also, there's sort of like a paradox when it comes to this. you want a balance between cards that say exactly what you want them to say and cards that actually offer reasoning. So I know there's like some cards out there that say exactly what you want it to say, and that might be like very far-fetched, but it happens to say what you want to say. But that becomes pretty problematic later in the debate round when you're trying to warrant, or if during cross-examination or crossfire when your opponents are asking you behind the reasoning to this argument and you can't come up with anything. So you want a balance between cards that say ideal arguments and cards that offers like reasoning behind this. And this comes in a number of ways. So for example, if that kind of leads into the next point about that cards that are good should cite examples of first-hand sources, especially for political statements or statistics. So if you're saying something like, okay, Trump is going to win now, preferably your card cites at least some poll or some statistic about how right now the votes are skewed in either way. And if you want something that says, like, if you want something that talks about, oh, Trump's policy is X, Y, and Z, preferably you preferably want a piece of evidence that cites what Trump said in one of his I guess like meetings or whatever that talks about that instead of just like putting words in their mouth. And yeah, so these 5 things you want to look into very carefully when you find cards. Usually they're pretty generic, but if you have these 5 things, it'll be pretty easy to argue. All right, so now I'm going to move on to some logistics about cards. So you have your pieces of evidence in a round. And these are kind of miscellaneous, but I thought they were really important to address because not a lot of people teach you them. And if you go into a round, like when I started as a novice, some of these things were pretty foreign to me, and that made it pretty hard to start. So the first thing is that characteristics of evidence are meant to be compared, and that makes speeches a lot more powerful. So when you see a piece of evidence or pieces of evidence that your opponents read, it's not just the tagline that or the argument that they try to make that you want to refute, but it's the evidence itself. So a lot of novices will read the tagline at the top of the card that says like, oh, X, Y, and Z, and they think, "Oh, dude, that's a really good argument. How am I supposed to answer that?" But the point is that the taglines are meant to like favor yourself. That's why they're written by yourself, and that's why they're the thesis of your argument. But that's where it becomes more important to read the actual meat of the card. And I know this takes a lot of time, especially in a high pressure debate round when you don't have a lot of prep time or when you're trying to come up with answers. But if you can get used to not only reading the tagline or the argument that they're trying to make, but the actual content of the card, you'll 99% of the time find at least one flaw in the card that you're able to point out in a card. And that makes your speeches a lot more powerful, and it lets the judge know that you understand exactly what they're trying to say, and you probably even know more about their evidence than they do. The second is that a variety of specific cards are better than a few generics. So what I mean by this is that usually a lot of teams will roll up and they have like a few generics and they can read it any round because it pertains to basically anything, or and like a case that's like very broad. That's good, and it probably cuts down on a lot of your prep time, but it also becomes really problematic when you're going against teams with different arguments. So you want specific cards that address specific cases. So i.e. in public forum, when you're debating a topic, you'll have teams with a bunch of different cases and advantages on an Affineg team. You want specific cards prepped against each one, and that makes your cases a lot more persuasive. The third is that debate camps slash open evidence resources are your friends. And what I mean by this is that, so for policy and public forum, I think for every form of debate, there are at least a few debate camps being held each year. And usually they will release their files to the public through certain resources like their online library or their website. And you can usually find these online. I know if you do public forum debate, you've probably heard of things like victory briefs or yeah, stuff like that. They usually contain free evidence that you can just download for your own use, and that's a great introduction to find a lot of cards. And usually they're like good, good substantive cases that you can find there. The fourth is that this kind of feeds into the second point about having a variety of specific cards, but that you should constantly update and cut cards throughout the season. So usually camps will release a bunch of cards at the very beginning of the year during summer, and if you just use those cards and recycle them over and over again throughout the entire year, that's probably really bad. And it'll lead to, you'll probably end up falling behind teams who constantly research throughout the season. Not only will they have more recent evidence than you, but they'll also have more specific and a greater quantity. And next is that there's non-underlined parts of cards, and that becomes really important. So that also is kind of related to point one about how when you're cutting a card, and I'll talk more about this later, the parts that are underlined and the parts that are highlighted that they read are the parts of the card that are probably the most important and say exactly what the opponents want to say. But if you read like all the shrink and the small text, and you read word for word exactly what the card is saying, a lot of times teams will exclude arguments in the cards that aren't ideal. And if you can cherry pick these things out of their cards, that also becomes very persuasive. And next is evidence and email chain. This is just something that I added in. I'm pretty sure you guys all know, but when you're in a debate round, you usually send all the evidence that you use in a speech to your opponents and to the judge. So this also feeds into like the importance of having good cards and having cards that that warrant out the arguments that you're trying to make. Because good judges will usually read cards after the debate round and see how like close the evidence matches your argumentation. And the final one is don't clip cards or skip highlighting. This is really bad and probably the most important thing on here, especially if you're going to good tournaments. So I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but if you recall what I said about when you're reading cards, how you read all the highlighted portions of the card. If you skip portions of highlighting because you're running out of time, but you don't make it explicit that you skipped the card, that could probably result in you just outright losing the round and or getting disqualified from the tournament. I know it doesn't seem that serious, but it's seen as cheating because you don't want to like when you highlight a card, you're basically declaring that you're going to read that piece of evidence. And if that doesn't happen, it's kind of like secondhand plagiarism. So if you don't get to a part of a card, or if you're halfway through a card and you want to skip it or you run out of time, you always want to say mark card at and then say the word that you last left off on. And if you say that, that makes it explicit to the judge and the opponents that that's where you left off. And then, okay, so I guess that was a lot of rambling about evidence and debate in general. So I know that lecture is supposed to be about how to cut cards, so let's get into that. All right, so if there's anything in the lecture that you actually pay attention to, you can pretty much forget everything I just said and just pay attention to this like 5-minute segment that'll teach you how to cut a card in policy debate or any form of debate because they're generally all the same. So here I have an example. It's the text, so the word for word text from this article, this URL that I've copy and pasted into a Word doc or a verbatim document. And if you guys still haven't downloaded verbatim, I put the download link in the chat. It's basically just an attachment to Word. And if you look at my Word doc, on the top left-hand side, it says debate right here. It basically just adds some macros to your Word doc that make it able so that you can cut cards and have certain functions that are pretty advantageous when you're trying to do debate. All right, so anyway, so this is like the word for word copy and paste of a article I found online, and there's been nothing done to it. And as you can see, it's still in like paragraph by paragraph form. So step by step tutorial on how to cut cards. Let me know if you need a certain step repeated. And I can't see the chat right now, so you'll just have to speak up if that's okay. And yeah, as I said again, this is like the one part of the lecture that you want to pay attention to because it's just a tutorial on how to cut cards. So you have a card like this. What you want to do first is you want to highlight the entire card. And if you guys have a verbatim file, you can follow along. But if not, you can always reference the recording later when you're trying to do this later on through the year. But right now, I'm just going to walk through it. So I have this verbatim template open. In this debate file, there's a condense function right here. If you press that, or if you press F and F3, if you can see there's like a shortcut key right here that says F3. If you press condense, that'll make the entire body of the card into one paragraph. And that makes it a lot more easy to read and it takes up less space. Okay, so what you want to do after this is you have your entire card, the entire article into one body. You can highlight the whole card and you see there's like some underline and some like orange text. I don't really want that, so I'll just underline everything and change all the text to black. So now I have just one chunk of the entire article in one paragraph. And what you want to do after this is, I talked about how the underlying parts of the card are what like the part of the card that you want to stand out, and the rest that's irrelevant you want to just shrink so that it saves space. So I have this whole article here. This article is talking about how right now, like the majority of police departments don't use body cameras, and that's problematic. So what I want to do in this scenario is I want to read the article slowly and underline the parts that I think are the most relevant for the judge and the opponents to see. And I guess I sort of like read the article already, so I'll just do this quickly. But and as you can see, like if I hit this underline function right under the condense function, it'll just I can highlight and it'll just underline what I selected. All right, so when you have a piece of evidence like this that you want to make a card and you've underlined all the parts that are most relevant to what you want to say. In this case, I've selected certain sentences. Usually you want it to be full sentences, but it doesn't have to. So you don't have to start from the beginning of a sentence. You can just highlight portions of sentences, but try to not make it too choppy. And usually underlining is like the most stuff you do. So now that you have the most important parts underlined, you want to make the rest of the text smaller than the underlined portion. So how you do that is you highlight the entire card, including the underlined portions. And you see I've used a condense and underline function. There's a shrink function on the bottom. And it says shrink text. When I click on that, it shrinks everything except the underlined parts. So that's what, as you can see, now it's a lot more condensed. And if I have a file with a bunch of cards in it, it's a lot easier to navigate. Okay, so I have the body of the text. I have the relevant parts shrunk and the most important parts underlined. Now what I want to do is, I talked about highlighting and how you read the highlighted portions. You want to now highlight the portions that you're actually going to read. And that's almost 100% of the time going to be less stuff than what you underlined. So you underline the most important parts and you highlight only the very specific parts that you want to read. And again, in this case, it can be even choppier than what you underline. It doesn't have to be full sentences. In fact, you can highlight specific parts of sentences and piece it together to form sentences. And sometimes that can be pretty funny, but what you want to do is you can highlight just a singular word from a sentence to keep the sentence going. So in this case, I can highlight like this. I can say, arriving at a solid estimate of how many law enforcement agencies are using technology is quite difficult. It's a kind of question that's best suited to surveys. We found 2 organizations with 3 such surveys that would work: the Police Executive Research Forum and the BJS. They combine to paint a consistent portrait of steady growth among U.S. adopting body camera programs, from the quarter agencies in 2013 to 45% in 2016, and increased about 1,200 agencies per year. If that trend continued into 2017 and 2018, since most technology markets tend to reach saturation, body camera purchasing activity took a dip in 2017, then that would mean that 10,500 agencies, or 58% of all law enforcement departments in the US, use body cameras by the end of 2018. And then the number of agencies that have adopted body cameras does not necessarily equate to the number of police using body cameras or the number of people who live in communities where police use body cameras. And that's just using the highlighting function. You can find that like in regular Word too. It's just right here. And now I have basically the entire body portion of the card done. So I have the irrelevant portions shrunk, the most important parts underlined and big, and the parts I'm going to read in the round highlighted. So after you have this is just a body. Again, I talked about how there's a tagline, citation, and body. So now what you want to do is you want to write the tag. So if you look, and if you like recall the format, usually the tag is at the very top in bold above the citation and the body. So in this case, there's a tag function right here. Basically, if you go to the debate tab in verbatim, if any of you guys have already downloaded it, following along, it's probably a lot easier. You have all these functions here. If you click on the tag function or FNF7, it'll automatically bold your text and make it look like this. And if you look at the left-hand side of my screen, where there's like a navigation panel, this also makes it a lot easier to organize files, because if you can see when I type in text, when I type in a tag format, it pops up as like a header here. So if I have a bunch of cards, it will show up like each one listed here, so I can just click around and navigate between the file. So in this case, this card is talking about how right now most law enforcement agencies don't, like, not sufficient amount of law enforcement agencies use body camera, and police haven't really adopted body cameras, and that by the end of 2018, only about 58% of law enforcement departments in the US would have them. So if I were to make a tagline, again, the tagline is like the thesis of the argument and a concise summary of what the entire card says. I would write something like, there is still a lack of body camera usage. By 2019, less than 58% of law of departments have them, and those don't, though, wait, those that have them don't necessarily use them. So in like 2 sentences, I basically summed up what the entire card says in a very like brief and easy to remember form. So there's still a lack of body camera usage by 2019. Less than 58% of departments have them. Those that have them don't necessarily use them. And as you can see, after I type that, there's like a little tab right here. And if I have a bunch of cards, again, that makes it really easy to navigate. Okay, so now I have the tagline, which is this bolded portion, and the body of the card done. Now all that's missing is the citation, right? And that's pretty easy. It's probably like the most boring and like busy portion of the card. So how you want to do this is, again, you go back to your little panel that you have on verbatim with all your functions here. If you look at F7, which is tag, F8 is cite. If you click on that, it also bolds your text, but it doesn't create a little subheader. And if you remember about what what you include in the bold part of a citation is the last name of the author or the organization that wrote the piece of evidence and the date. So in this case, from this source, I already like looked at this source, so I know the last name of the author is Miller, and it was published in 2019. So I'll write Miller 19 in the citation format, and that would be what I read in around. But I also need the rest of the citation, right? So on the slide, I talked about how you need like all the parts of the citation, which are like the author name, their credentials, the name of the source, the publisher, the date, and the URL. So again, I already have this information, but what you want to do is, if you look at this card, only the author and the last name are in cite and bold, right? Under this, the rest is like small because you don't need to read that, and it kind of just gets in the way. So what you can do is you can just type it in parentheses right next to the big cite portion. So in this case, I can just like write it quickly, like then, or I don't actually have to write anything. I'll just like write some random stuff. And let's say this is my citation. What I can do, because I don't want this part to be bold, right? I'll just highlight it. I'll just unbold it. I'll go over here and I'll just shrink the font to like 8. So after I have that, like, that's a complete card. And if you see, it looks like really similar to all these completed cards I already had. So you have the tagline, which is this right here, that use the tag function that says there's still a lack of body camera usage by 2019. Less than 50% of departments use them. Those that have them don't necessarily use them. You have Miller 19, which is the citation you read in round. This part you would not read in round. Again, I don't write the citation because that would be pretty time consuming. But if you reference the slides I had earlier, it's in the author of the name of the author, their credentials, so what they do, their degree. That's usually found on like the news site if you just like look up their name, the name of the article, the publisher, the date, and then the URL. And then I have this. This was originally like a lot longer and a lot bigger, if you notice, but this is like a copy and pasted text of an entire news article. And what I did was I underlined the portions that were the most important and relevant to the point I was trying to make. And I shrunk the rest of the text using the shrink function here. and then at the end I highlighted it, and the highlighted portion is what I would actually read. So I would read the tag, this bolded citation, and the highlighting. Does anyone need like a repetition or any of the steps re-explained? I know that was kind of like fast and sort of like choppy. So if anyone needs like a certain part re-explained, I'll try to do that slower.
Is it possible to change the settings so the font is bigger?
What portion of the font? Like the tag
Just
or?
like overall, like if you can just change all the small text from 8 to like 10 and all the underlined text from whatever it is to like 2 points bigger. Is it possible to do that?
Okay, so in default, I'm pretty sure the verbatim file auto shrinks it to 8. If you look at like the little thing, it has like an 8 thing next to it. But it doesn't really matter. Like if it's easier on your eyes, you can always just use like go like this. I'm pretty sure you have to do it manually. I could be wrong, and because I've never really changed the font size, but there could be a possibility of making it. But if you see here, it says like sets all non-underlined text in the paragraph to 8 point and smaller. So if you don't want it, it doesn't really matter. Like no one's gonna care if you make it bigger, if it's easier on your eyes to read in the round. What you can do is just like manually change it if you want, or just like manually change all of it. Just like take all the text and make it bigger manually through home, just like whatever font you want. And honestly, no one really care. Like I've also seen evidence in the beta round that hasn't been shrunk, so they just don't use the shrink function, and all the text was the same size, like this size, and they made it like bigger, so they made it like 12 point font or 13 point font. You can always do that too, and you can use different fonts. There's not really like a universal font that you have to use in debate. So if like Calibri is too small, if like Arial is a bit bigger, that's fine too. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Is there any other questions? I know my explanation might have been a little quick, so also it's probably a bit difficult if you don't have the debate template to follow along with. But if you like have it installed and you can see my screen and follow the functions, it shouldn't be that hard. Like the rest of the
How,
lecture was, yeah, go ahead.
how do you get the big underlined text in the middle, like EX?
Oh, like this?
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess like that's not part of cutting cards, but I can talk a little bit about this. So this file, obviously I talked about how I'm using a verbatim file. If you guys want it, I put the link to the download in the text in the chat again. It's like pretty helpful. So this is a card, and if you look, I use like the tag, condense, underline, shrink uh functions. There's a lot of other functions that you can do. So this function, if you go over here, it's called a block. So if I write something like this and I highlight it and I press block, it'll like automatically indent it to the middle and underline it. And if you look on the heading on the left hand side, these blocks are essentially like big headers. So you can think of the tag as like subpoint headers and the block as bigger headers. And there's also a function called hat right next to block. And if I type something else and put it in hat format, it'll indent it and it'll double underline it and make it even bigger. And that's like essentially a header even bigger than the block. So it would be like if you want to organize your file, these functions, they're up to you on how you want to use them. But I think they're pretty helpful because when you have a navigation panel like Word provides you, you can always use the hat as like a big header for something you want to organize, these blocks as like subpoints, and then the tags you'll obviously need like for each card. So what you can do is like, let's say you have a group of cards, like in this case here, this big like group of 4 cards or 5 cards that's a disadvantage. I use the block function to write DA, and then you can write something with the hat, like I don't know. In this case, I don't know what to write, but like you can write something like DAs, like all your DAs under this hat for a 1 and Z, and you can write here like if you use the block function, you can go like elections DA. And what it does is it puts the hat like on the biggest subpoint, the block on the next biggest subpoint, and if you click here, you can navigate through the different cards by just clicking on the headings. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't really know if we wait have time for a drill. Um, I mean, I could still do one, I guess, and make it brief. So originally, my intention for the drill. Let me share the PowerPoint. Okay, so my intention for the drill, if you look, was to have some of you guys, not all of you. I mean, all of you should definitely try, but like some of you, everyone cut a card that talks about economic downturn and the recession caused by COVID-19. And I have the article already provided here. I can send the link in the chat. And what I wanted to do and why I told you guys or told you all to download a verbatim paperless debate for this drill was to have you guys basically just cut a sample card from this one article uh, and use the functions that I used in debate to like make a singular card. I think I guess we can still try. I guess we can like try to do it now. Um, this will probably like once you do it once and cut your first card, it's pretty repetitive, and you like won't need much practice to get into the flow of things. So once you like learn how to do your first one, it's not that difficult to follow up and just start cutting cards right away. So I guess I'll put the uh, URL for the article in the chat. And basically what you'll need to do is install verbatim through the link I sent in the chat. It'll take you to the installation process and teach you how to just open a verbatim doc. And once you have a verbatim template open, which is basically it looks the same as just a regular Word doc, you'll be able to like use all the functions and stuff that they provide here that I used and do the same things I did to cut a card. And if you need like a step-by-step walk through again, if you have any questions, I can do that, I guess. So if possible, I guess if everyone in the lecture right now could open the article and use their verbatim template to cut a card. The article is already provided, so you won't have to like research yourself. Just I guess make the article that I sent into a card and use like the functions that I taught. And then if you're done and when you finish, since we're like running low on time, I'll just look at like one or two examples. If you can send like the file in the Zoom chat or email it to me, my email's on the slide. I can take a look at it and I can share it like on the screen and talk about any like improvements that could be made or just like look at it. And once you again like once you finish your first card, it's really not a difficult process to get going. They asked, we don't have to copy the stuff that's in brackets, right? No, if you're when you're cutting a card, you just all you have to copy and paste into your doc is the physical text. It's pretty like cutting cards is a pretty tough and like awkward process to explain online and through like Zoom chat, and it's a lot easier to just do it yourself. And once you do it once, it's a lot easier. It's a pretty simple process, but it looks kind of confusing, especially the first time using verbatim. It could be a little difficult, but once you memorize the steps, it comes to you pretty naturally. Yeah, so for any of you guys who are like, all of you guys should at least try the drill. I think it'll be really helpful. And once, like after this drill, you won't need any help doing it anymore. But for those who are willing to participate, it'll be really helpful if like the first few who finish just send like save it because it's just a Word doc. So if you save it and send it in a Zoom chat or email it to me, I can take a look and I'll go through just like one example or something.
How do you copy the article without getting all the pictures and the links to different articles and stuff?
Yeah, so I guess here I can share. So uh wait, let me actually open the direct article here. So this is what the article looks like for you, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so if you want to just copy the text, I guess just like go like this and drag like this, and this stuff you can copy and take it out later, but that's kind of a hassle. You could just go like this, copy and then paste into your Word doc, and then like highlight manually like this and just copy it. I don't think you would have a problem with the pictures, but I could be wrong. If you just highlight it, like just only highlight the text to copy and paste. Yeah, all you need is just the physical context and content of the article. So you don't need any of like the title of the article or anything like that. Oh, and also I forgot to mention one more thing. This is not that important, but when you have a card like this and you have like underlined here, I can share my screen again if that makes it easier. So when you have a card like this and you have like the underlined parts, there's another function that you can use. It's called emphasis. It's right above the shrink function. It's not that important, and honestly, like the most important is just having underlined portions and the highlighted portions that you're going to read. But the emphasis portions, if you highlight like words like this and you press emphasis, it just makes it bold. That really serves like no purpose at all aside from making certain points pop out. So generally, when you have the content of a card, you want to have like the most stuff highlighted, like anything that's somewhat relevant to your point should be highlighted. You want the second most stuff to be underlined because you want a coherent like sentences and coherent arguments to be made, even if you're only using parts of sentences like I did here, because that saves a lot of time. You want it to still form like coherent sentences and arguments. And you don't really need like many things emphasized. Like usually emphasis only serves to like forefront certain important vocabulary or certain examples. And at most, you should just emphasize like a few words in a sentence or a couple phrases. So like I can do an example here, I guess. So if I wanted to emphasize anything in this card, I guess it would be like a portrait of steady growth or something, or like the most important part of this card, like 58% of all lava forts use body cameras by 2018. I'll just emphasize that.